Evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Meet the Author with Jordan Salama. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Carey Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Carey Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please submit them to the chat. The book is available for purchase through Maxima Bookum. Our guest this evening, Jordan Salama, is an American writer of Argentine, Syrian, and Iraqi Jewish descent. His debut travelogue, Every Day the River Changes, takes readers on a 950-mile journey down the Magdalena River in Colombia. Jordan's work has appeared in outlets including the New York Times, National Geographic, and Scientific American. A 2019 graduate of Princeton University, he lives in New York. His book was named a Kirkus Reviews Best Book of 2021 and a top travel book of 2021 by the New York Times. Jordan, welcome. We are so excited to have you join us tonight.
Thank you, Helen, for having me, and it's very exciting to see so many people here. This is really wonderful.
I just want to start at the beginning. So of all the genres an author considers before they start writing a book, why did you decide to write a travelogue?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm not quite sure that there was ever a specific decision made that I was going to write a travelogue or even a book in the first place. This project started out as my college thesis. And I, was studying at Princeton, and I had a chance to travel in doing a kind of journey through Colombia to try to understand what I saw as to be a very misunderstood country. And I am interested in journeys kind of in general. Travelogues, travel writing, you can call this book all of those things, but maybe you can also call it nonfiction writing and creative nonfiction. So there's lots of names for what this is. But I am fascinated with this idea that journeys can connect disparate peoples and cultures. So in this case, the Magdalena is a river that cuts a cross section through, as I mentioned, a very, very varied and diverse landscape of communities. So I think that there's tremendous value in journeys to connect people.
Thank you for that, Jordan. So what actually inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, a number of things. So the way this book came about, again, it started out as my college thesis, but then it kind of transformed into what is now the book that people hold in your hands. As I mentioned, I had a chance to travel to Colombia after my first year in college to do an internship with the Wildlife Conservation Society, which has conservation projects all over the world. And I was able to travel through Colombia and document different communities in rural areas, working on interesting conservation projects. As I mentioned, everybody was kind of terrified for me when I said originally that I was going to go to Colombia because of what people kind of think of when they think of that country in the northwest corner of South America. There was one person who did not feel that way, and it was my childhood piano teacher named Sandra Munoz. She's from Colombia, and when I called her to tell her that I wanted to go, she said, "Oh my God, you have to go. My grandmother will take care of you. You should stay with her." And here I am thinking, this is fantastic. I'm going to stay with this wonderful grandmother who's going to take me around the city. But it turned out that she was 96 years old, the kindest woman in the world, but she couldn't get out of bed. And she locked the door every night at 7 p.m. And wouldn't let me leave the house after the sun went down. And this was her way of keeping me safe. And in those nights, under Sandra's grandmother's 7 p.m. curfew, I started keeping journals of the people I met, the experiences I had, the places I saw. And for the first time as a 19-year-old in a foreign country for the first time by myself, I was doing journalism, but I just didn't realize it at the time. Fast forward a couple of years, I take a class with the New Yorker writer who I'm sure many people have heard of and love, John McPhee, who kind of taught me what creative nonfiction was as a genre. It's kind of crazy to say that now that I didn't know what it was when I was a sophomore in college, but I didn't. And so little by little, I had this inkling of an idea that I wanted to write a story about the Magdalena because I went back to those notes that I took in Sandra's grandmother's house. And everybody talked about this river as this amazing, magical place filled with stories. And I'm always looking for amazing, magical places filled with stories.
Yeah, and you did talk about the fact that your grandfather traveled quite a bit. And so what intrigued you about your grandfather's travels, and how did these stories inspire you to want to tell your own?
Certainly. So I'm going to read a short passage as we've kind of planned on this, but to give a sense of what that passage from the book is going to be. My family, I was born and raised in New York, but my family kind of comes from everywhere. My mom was born in Baghdad, and my dad's family are Syrian Jews who ended up in Argentina and then to New York. So I've kind of always heard stories about my family on the move. And that got me thinking, I think, as from a very young age, that I wanted to tell those kinds of stories myself. So with that in mind, I'm going to read a very short passage from the book that might give a little bit of color to what I'm talking about. It didn't hurt my imagination that I come from a family that has long traversed the different corners of this earth. Some of the most memorable moments of my childhood were spent sitting beside aunts and uncles and grandparents as they told me, in a spellbinding mix of English, Spanish, and Arabic, histories of a family that seemed forever destined to be on the move. As with most travelers of their time, they were driven by circumstances beyond their control: religious persecution, economic opportunity, political strife. And yet they hadn't failed to pass down tales of the new cultures and enlightening experiences that they'd encountered on the road. I'd long been living vicariously through the stories of my grandfather, my father's father, himself a classmate of Che Guevara in medical school, who grew up in Buenos Aires and spent many years as a young doctor backpacking and training in the Argentine countryside before eventually moving to New York. Abuelo told me of his father, my great-grandfather, a Syrian Jewish immigrant to Argentina at the turn of the 20th century, who worked as an itinerant salesman on horseback in the Andes Mountains. There, as the story goes, the Arab Jew from Damascus became Argentine, learning Spanish from folk songs and card games, sitting around bonfires with gauchos, and sleeping in ranch houses along his trade route. Many of his relatives and compatriots, also fleeing religious persecution in the old Ottoman Empire, found their way to other nations of Latin America, among them Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia, where they built new lives and families and identities. On my mother's side, there was the great-great-great-grandfather who led a caravan of 1,000 camels along the famed Silk Road, trading carpets and textiles and spices in cities like Baghdad, Aleppo, Isfahan, and beyond. Other Baghdadi Jewish ancestors made it as far as Shanghai, Mumbai. In the stories, it sounded easy, their everyday bumps in the road smoothed over in favor of historical drama and tall tales. There seemed to be no port where their wanderings hadn't reached, and no place where there wasn't an adventure to be found. And I grew up hearing these stories and I wanted to be like them, but there was one key difference. And it was that my ancestors, these people from these stories, even my grandfather, my abuelo, who's still alive today and tells me these stories, he told me one yesterday. They mostly traveled because they had to. They moved because of, again, these reasons that I mentioned, whereas I am lucky enough to have grown up in a world where I can travel by choice. And we, I think, are maybe some other people can empathize with this, that the ability to travel because you want to, not because you have to, is a very special privilege. And so what I wanted to do with this book, one of the things I wanted to do was make that journey meaningful for other people, make that journey have an impact, that is to say. And hopefully that's what this book and all of my storytelling and writing in other places that is not this book, hopefully that's the kind of common thread through all of what I do.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you met so many people along the way during your travels. Was there one person in particular that intrigued you the most?
I've gotten this question from different groups, and it's always interesting to hear from people who have read the book who they gravitate towards as a character or a person who I met along the Magdalena. And as a result, I tend to think of different people every week when asked this question. But this week, I'm thinking a lot about a man named Simon Villanueva. Simon Villanueva was an 89-year-old filigree jeweler in a remote river town called Mompos. And for those of you who may not know what filigree is, it's this very elaborate jewelry kind of way of art that involves very intricate silver and gold loops and designs. And this man, for 77 years, he weaved golden fishes and silver sombreros and flowers from these threads of silver and gold. And I thought it was just so inspiring because he said something to the extent of, I live in love with my work. And even though for many years, hardly anybody came to buy his goods because the town was kind of forgotten by the river changing course, his jewels piled up beside him in a glass cabinet because he could not stop making objects of beauty in what he called a world of struggle. So I'm thinking a lot about, I think a lot about Simon Villanueva, who unfortunately is no longer with us. I think a lot about him when I think about all the things that are going wrong with the world and how sometimes it can be easy to despair. Um, I think back to Simon Villanueva, who did his very small part in his own way to make beauty in a world of struggle. And that to me is very meaningful.
Yeah, and that also brings to mind the other gentleman that you met, and I don't recall his name, but he was building canoes. And it wasn't exactly his first job. It was a means to an end. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. He was a fisherman. He began as wanting to be a fisherman, but then he quickly realized that he was much better at building the boats than fishing from them, as he said. So he, with very little means, again, built these kind of really beautiful rainbow-colored canoes that lined up on a wharf in the town of Neiva, closer to where the river begins. And the whole time he was talking about how he's an artisan and he's a craftsman, and how much how proud he was of what he did. And then I noticed that his 6-year-old granddaughter was skipping through the yard of canoes and playing in the boats. And I went up to her and I asked her, because I always try to speak with kids and elderly people alike on these journeys. I asked her if she was going to grow up and build canoes like her grandfather. An innocent question. I really didn't mean anything by it. But the grandfather that is, interrupted me almost immediately and said something to the extent of, she's going to study. She's not going to make canoes. And at that moment, I realized that he was not as proud of making canoes as maybe it seemed.
Sure. And
There's sorry to interrupt, but there's levels there, right? Where
yeah,
you can be really proud of something to an extent, but in the context of something greater where you start to see the opportunities that you can make for the people who come after you and your family, I think that he realized that and wanted to make sure that his grandchildren were following that path instead of the one he took, which was a difficult one.
yeah, that's definitely what grandparents usually do. They want to make sure that you follow a better path than what they had. But certainly you did meet quite a few people along the way, and you always gravitated to some of the older individuals because you wanted to hear their stories. And what about the older individuals what did you want to know?
Well, the Magdalena as a river, I'm very interested in how this is kind of played out with the book, because people don't know about it in the United States. When they think of rivers in Latin America, maybe they think of the Amazon, or they think of the Orinoco, or they think of, I don't know, other great rivers that are not the Rio de la Plata, for example, in Argentina. They don't think of the Magdalena. And yet it's one of the most storied rivers in Latin America. Storied in the sense that there's a lot going on now that's really important. There's a lot of sociopolitical context of conflict and environmental damage that's really important and that I delve into in the book. But then it's also a storied river in the sense that it's really, the people who live along it are really inspired, and their lives are really marked by folk tales and legends and oral histories all along its banks. And so by seeking out the oldest people along the Magdalena, I kind of got the full picture of how this river, which changes a lot as the title of the book suggests, how much the river has changed in their lifetime and in what way. Now, at the same time, I also sought out the youngest people in every town that I went to, because I was really interested in the contrast. What do the oldest people have to say about the Magdalena in the same place as the youngest, a 12-year-old? What does a 12-year-old have to say about life along this ever-changing river? And those contrasts ended up being some of what I think to be the most interesting chapters of the book.
Yeah, definitely. I think you learned quite a bit from the older generation. There was one comment that someone made about, and it's actually the title of your book. They talked about how the Magdalena teaches you a lesson, and every day it changes, and so it never stays the same.
Yeah, I love this title, and how it came about was a big coincidence. But we got to this title from this man's quote, which was really great, because I think that it's a multi-layered title. That when that man spoke of the Magdalena changing every day, he was a boat captain. So he was literally talking about this river's, the way that the tides were flowing, the way that the currents changed. Like, he was actually physically speaking about the river changing every day because he was riding a boat on it every day. But the Magdalena changes in other ways too that are maybe not as clear from the beginning, but become clearer as the book goes on. And that is that the people who live along the Magdalena, and actually most people in Colombia, whether or not they live close to the river, their fates and the country's fate tends to ebb and flow with these changes of the Magdalena. Colombia is a country in constant flux. It's almost hard to write anything about it that comes out that doesn't come out immediately, because you can write a book or a magazine article and have it come out 4 weeks after you finished writing it. And like the whole thing could be different. And you feel like, oh my God, I've made a terrible mistake. I've written all of these things and now they're all different. So that was the biggest challenge with this book, was that the country is in such a state of transition, which is why I think the book is interesting. Why I hope the book is interesting to people. But as a result, it was a challenge to write about a place that was constantly in flux.
Right, and you also visited the Magdalena Medio, correct? And you met some sea captains along the way there, and you met people who were digging on the sediment, and they were digging the sediment so that they could sell it to be used for cement making. And it struck me that when you said these individuals were doing this hard work, and yet in postcards, that same area was used for people who were vacationing.
And these are the kinds of contrasts that I'm talking about, where there were people literally sunbathing on a sand island of the shallow Magdalena that's no longer navigable by boats, while these men were toiling in the shallows very close to them. And what they were doing, though they were very interested in talking about it, is one of the most environmentally destructive activities that could be done to a river, is taking out the sediment from the bottom of its banks. And so there was a kind of sad and cruel irony happening there, which was that this river has been destroyed. Those people's ancestors once lived a life of prosperity along this river. And now these people were condemned to a life toiling in digging out and making the situation worse, which I think is in some ways, other people have pointed this out to me, which I didn't even maybe necessarily fully realize from the start, is that it's kind of a parable for the climate crisis that we're all going through now, right? Where we take and take and take and keep taking and keep taking and keep taking, because we think we're going to somehow, it's going to get us out of the problem that we've caused for ourselves. But it just keeps snowballing in a terrible effect. And that was what I noticed firsthand on this river in a kind of small scale way.
Right, and it's not only affecting the way people's livelihoods, but certainly affecting the animals that live there. Certainly the little black turtles, and also the hippos. Tell us about the hippos and that trip. That was exciting.
Yeah, the Magdalena River, for those who may not know, is the only place in the world where hippopotamuses live in the wild outside of Africa. They don't belong there. They're invasive. When in 1995 or 1994, in the mid-90s, when Pablo Escobar was killed, the kind of notorious drug mastermind of Colombia, when he was killed by the government, he had 4 pet hippopotamuses in his private zoo, and they didn't know what to do with them. So they just kind of left them there, and they escaped into the river and have now proliferated. There's like 100 of them, 100 hippopotamuses that live in this river. And a lot of times it's kind of treated as a cartoonish news story. Oh, the hippopotamuses in Colombia. In reality, this causes a huge problem for the people who live there. Fishermen whose boats are rocked by hippopotamuses popping up out of the water when they least expect it, or tearing at their nets, or farmers being chased off of their land by hippos running around like cows. It's a terrible problem, and it's also a big ecological and biological conundrum for scientists who are trying to figure out what the answer is to this issue. So I took a journey with local community leaders and scientists who are studying those hippopotamuses, and they showed me what was going on. And I saw the hippopotamuses with my own eyes. There were 2 of them there in the shallow water. And that was right when our boat's motor died, right in front of them. And I thought I was going to die in that moment. That was not the safest moment of the trip.
Yeah, that must have been a bit frightening.
Definitely. You're in South America and there's two hippopotamuses like less than 20 yards away from you, and your boat doesn't have a motor. And then luckily the boat's motor sped back to life. They were chugging at the chain, and we sped away before anything happened. But they turned, the two hippos turned like this. And they looked at us, and then they opened their mouths really wide, kind of like you see on like planet Earth, but not in South America, which is the point of all this.
Yeah, and so did they say there were 100 of them now because there aren't any natural predators?
Yeah, they literally thrive in this habitat, and they're displacing local wildlife, but there's no predators. It's illegal to hunt them now. That's one of the many problems that has come up with trying to figure out a solution to this. Is people were very upset that they were hunting the hippopotamuses. But yeah, there's estimates range, and most hover around 100.
Right, but they're also changing the river itself with their waste, and they're also eating all the fish. So that obviously affects the people who live along the river, who rely on the river for food and for work. So that must have been difficult to see.
Certainly. Again, understanding the kind of real world impacts of what seems to be a out of this world problem.
Right, exactly. An old woman once told you that to understand the river is to understand the country. Can you talk about what that means to you now?
Now, after having been working on this project for something like 4 years, what does it mean to understand a country? So I don't think that I've fully understood Colombia, just like I don't think anybody can really understand an entire country. But this woman had told me, this was at the very beginning when I was still not sure if I was going to write about the Magdalena at all. She told me that to understand the river was to understand the country, because kind of like the Mississippi in the United States, but kind of on a whole other level, the Magdalena really represents people's prides and people's stories when they think of their country. I'm speaking for Colombians when I say this. Colombians who I spoke with all along its banks and elsewhere. Everybody thinks of this river as the heart of the nation. They call it the fluvial artery because it literally is the blood vessel that brings in and out everything that's most important that happens in Colombia goes through the Magdalena. So again, in the way that I said that in the beginning, that journeys cut threads through diversity, rivers do that. And I love rivers because I think they are connectors. And that's what the Magdalena does.
Great. The people you met along the way, they told many myths about the enchanted places that you visited, mostly the remote ones. Which myth frightened you the most, and did you ever believe any of it was true?
I don't know if I was frightened by any of them. They weren't the scariest stories. They were for the kids, definitely, but I think that I was I didn't buy into the scary stories that I was told. But it is really interesting to see how life is reflected in myths and legends, and how myths and legends reflect real life, kind of how it goes both ways. That's something that I've always been interested in, maybe because of the kinds of stories that I heard growing up, as I mentioned before, these kind of otherworldly tales that may be fantastical and magical, like a woman who runs away with her family's gold and drowns in the river, enchanting the river for all of eternity, but also meaning that it's forever hostile to visitors. That, to me, when hearing that myth told over and over and over again, and finding what are the common threads that every person holds on to, even though every person tells the story a little bit differently, tells you what matters most about that folktale or that oral history. And I think that what tends to matter most about these oral histories and folktales are the parts that are rooted in real people's real life experiences, but are meant to understand the world through stories of fantasy and tall tales. So it was really fascinating to include that as a kind of part of my research along the river. And there's many, many more folktales that I left out. This river is just filled with stories, as I said at the beginning.
Right, and it seems that there are so many people who live along the river that you couldn't possibly tell all their stories, I'm sure.
Right. And this is something that I write near the end of the book, which is that I was very cognizant of the fact that for every story I told, I was leaving another story out. And that's a painful thing for a writer who loves to collect stories, because you want to include everything, but you realize that people only want to read some, or are able to read so much about a river that they don't know anything about. And you have to grab them and keep them grabbed and keep them going. And so there was definitely a process of selection that went into this. And yeah, I mean, it's the biggest challenge of being a journalist and being a writer, is that you report stories that never make it into the world, which is always a little bit disappointing.
Right. I'm sure it's difficult to have to choose which stories to tell, because of all the wonderful people that you met. But, you talked quite a bit about traveling to remote places, and in some cases, it was a little scary for you, as an American, as someone who might not know the areas. Um, what was it like for you when you were traveling to some of these areas where people warned you not to go? Were you ever afraid?
People definitely warned me not to go to lots of parts of the country, but I made sure to do it in a way that was responsible, and where I traveled by myself, but I was never alone. I was always received by people in every town where I went. So I never felt in danger. I wasn't kidding when I said that the hippopotamuses were maybe the scariest part of the trip. And even that, I didn't think that my life was fully at risk really at all. But it was scary nonetheless. No, all I found was kindness. And maybe that was the most surprising thing about this trip. If you think about what a country's most common evocations or connotations are, and what you hear about when you don't know about a place, but then when you go take a closer look, at least in Colombia, and I think that this is true of most of the world is filled with good people. And I found kindness everywhere and hospitality everywhere I turned. People wanted to show their world to me, and therefore their world to the people who would read what I wrote. People were really proud to be able to do that.
Right. And then you wrote in your book that when a place is warm, people are warm too. But there were two juxtaposing realities to that. One, you already mentioned the fact that they were really kind. They were so willing to accommodate you and show you around. But the other piece of that was the fact that in some cases, you knew that you were a traveler and you could leave at any point. And you talked about this when the tourists came to go tubing down the river. And you talked about how, you were just traveling and that you didn't have to stay. But these people, this is the way that they live. And, as kind as they were to you, it was just a place for them where they were going to stay forever and you can just go home.
Right. And this goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, which is traveling by choice is in its own way a big privilege that you have to reconcile, especially when you're writing about any journey that you take. At least that's how I feel. So I made sure not to romanticize what I was seeing, to make sure that I was giving the appropriate context to what was going on, but also that I wasn't shying away from pointing out beauty, because I think it's really important to point out beauty even in difficult places, especially actually in difficult places. I think it's really important to point out beauty. So yeah, that juxtaposition was really important to me throughout the reporting trip and throughout the writing of the book. And I think that, overall, I would like to make the point that this is travel writing. We kind of call it travel writing for a new generation. And that doesn't mean that only one generation of people can read it, but really what it means is that we want to bring travel writing into a new generation for readers who want to read empathetic stories about journeys, respectful stories about journeys that aren't making fun of people, that aren't othering people or making it sound like, oh, I'm visiting this exotic place. I come from America. Look at how these people live. That's not the point of this journey. The point of this story and this book is to center those people's voices. And in many cases, I kind of just step out of the way. And that was something that we worked very hard on. And my editor and I, we made sure that was kind of the situation of the book, because that was the situation of my journey. It was really a true exchange. We would share stories about each other's lives, about each other's families. I really immersed myself in people's lives for a couple of days in each place. And the result were some really special stories and encounters.
Yeah,
And the fact that I think about some of my favorite travelogues that I've read in my life, like The Old Patagonian Express by Paul Theroux or In Patagonia by Bruce Chatwin. And I think about sometimes that these books, which were written in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, I often think like these people met so many wonderful people along the way. How did they keep in touch, if not by letters, which I would imagine are really hard to send to places like the plateaus in Bolivia? And the answer is probably that they didn't keep in touch with those people. Whereas in my case, because of WhatsApp and Facebook, I talk to these people like almost every week. So the book has evolved even after I left the Magdalena, based on the stories that people told me from afar afterwards. So it's kind of the culmination of a 3 to 4 year reporting journey, even though the actual physical journey only took 4 weeks.
well, that's fantastic that you still keep in touch. Who do
Yeah,
you keep in touch
it's really
with?
rewarding.
Who do you keep in touch with the most?
Oh, that's a good question. I keep in really close touch with, well, maybe this would be a good time for me to run down for people who haven't read the book, the kinds of people who I meet in this book who I haven't talked about already.
Sure.
So we mentioned the elderly canoe builder. I mentioned the elderly filigree jeweler. We talked about the biologist studying invasive hippopotamuses. I met a really intrepid and amazing woman who's launching a turtle conservation project in her community. I met a school teacher who runs a traveling library on a donkey to bring books to his school children in rural areas who don't have access to libraries. Who else? I met an archaeologist who took me into the highlands of the Andes to look for ancient megalithic statues. He was tragically murdered a year after I met him. And I don't know, just this amazing array of people. And of all of them, I probably keep in touch the most closely with the Traveling Donkey Library, the Biblioburro, Luis Soriano, and a woman named Alejandra Majorca, who I took a 6-hour boat journey down the river with. She accompanied me. She was the friend of a friend of a friend. I never expected her to come on this trip with me in the first place. At the very last minute, she said she would come. And she was a really life-changing character she was a life-changing person for me to meet. And I think for a lot of people who read this book, she tends to be a really impactful character for readers as well, because she lives a life unencumbered by the stresses of the world to the extent that she can. She calls herself a nomadic person. She makes decisions out of passion and impulse, and not because of what people expect her to do. And as a result, she has some of the most incredible stories that I've ever heard from a single person in my life. So if you read the book, I encourage you to look out for Alejandra Majorca, who called me just a couple of days ago. And we had a really, really nice conversation. And I told her how many people were reading and commenting about her story. And she was really, really touched.
That's fabulous that you keep in touch with them. And so what do you want readers to come away with when they read your book?
I think that if there was one thing that I would like readers to come away with from this book, it is this idea that there is hope in places of despair. We talked about beauty in difficult places, right? And highlighting moments of beauty. I write a lot about kite flying in this book. Kite flying as an activity that people do all along the banks of the Magdalena during the month where I traveled. It was this activity where the whole day would be miserably hot, oppressively hot. Nobody felt like they could do anything at all. But then the winds changed at 4 p.m. and all the kids and adults would run into the hills outside town and make kites out of plastic bags and sugarcane stalks and fly them in the air in this like dazzling array of colors. And it was really beautiful. And that is a symbol in this book, as many of these interactions are, of hope in a world that's quite challenging, a world of conflict. And maybe now, though our situation is certainly different from the situation of people who live in Colombia, just as the people in Colombia's situation are different from people who live in any other country. Maybe there are some universal themes that can be taken away from that in this pandemic world where we're in a constant flux between isolation and freedom, and everything seems dark sometimes. We don't know how to get out of, the trials and tribulations of our life. How can we find these pieces, these moments of inspiration, of passion, and of hope to bring us forward. And that's exactly what these people are doing in a situation of conflict. So yeah, hope would be what I'd say to that.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to take a look at how these people along the river live when they're just so cooperative with each other. I'm thinking back to the trip that you took on the Moto Bolero. Is that how you pronounce it?
The Moto Balinera, yeah.
Balinero. And I was just a bit fascinated by the fact that they have this way of transportation that is unfamiliar to us, but yet more the fact that they're so cordial, to say the least, when they're riding on it. You talk a bit about how, as you go along the track, if someone else is coming the other way, they basically have to stop or take it apart and get off the track and let the other person go.
Yeah, this is the craziest mode of transportation I've ever been on in my life. And I'm somebody who loves crazy modes of transportation. So that's saying a lot. The Moto Balinera is a wooden platform that's built on railroad wheels and powered by a motorcycle along what they call abandoned train tracks. But then someone whispered to me that if the freight train did happen to come off schedule, we would have to be prepared to jump. So the freight train didn't come, luckily for me. But yeah, and so when what was more common that would come in the opposite direction were other of these carts, whether it was carrying people sitting on plastic lawn chairs or a man, using an oar to row bananas along the train tracks. The person who had what was perceived to be the more inconvenient cargo got to stay. And the other person, no matter how heavy the cargo was, would have to lift the entire thing off the tracks so that the rest of the people could go by. So yeah, Moto Balinero was, it only moved like 12 miles an hour, but I felt like I was flying. That thing felt like it was going fast, and it was in the pitch black, and you could see like silent lightning off in the mountains in the distance. It was surreal. The Moto Balinero, crazy.
I think the part that made me laugh was the fact that there were plastic chairs that you could stack up, and then when there were more people that needed to jump on board, you would just stop and unpack the rest of the plastic chairs.
Yeah, like those patio chairs that you have at barbecues, like literally that.
That's great. What did you learn about yourself during this entire trip?
This is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but I became a writer. I mean, nothing more formative could have happened to me on this trip than giving me the opportunity to write something like this for the first time that goes into other people's hands who are reading it. And it's been a surreal ride to see a inkling of an idea turn into a senior thesis, turn into maybe a collection of articles to then turn into a full-fledged book. Was really interesting and a wild ride. And I think that I've learned about myself as a storyteller by doing this work. And I have since done other kinds of stories, that some of which you can find on the internet in various places, and some haven't come out yet. But I think that if you read this book, you can see kind of common threads through all of my work. And that's because this was just a really formative experience for me as a young writer and a young person.
Did you ever think that you were going to become a writer? I know you talked about how it all started when you were writing those journals. I mean, like you said, that was just kind of something to pass the time. Did you really think that you were going to write a book with all of that?
At the time, definitely not. I knew since I was young that I think I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know what kind of writer I wanted to be. I thought maybe I wanted to write for television or to write movie screenplays, but I wasn't very good at that. And I found what I was good at, and it was really rewarding to find maybe not what I was good at, but what I enjoyed doing and what worked for me. is telling stories of real life that are sometimes extraordinary. And it's been really wonderful to be able to do that full time as like a job, and to go and meet people. And I feel like I'm learning as a student all the time, which is special.
I think in reading your book, what I would enjoy the most is meeting everyone, meeting all the wonderful people that live along the river, and just really understanding how they live.
Yeah, I think that in general, across the board, my favorite thing to do is to meet people and to talk to people. My least favorite thing is actually writing. That stinks. When you come off this high of like having done something really amazing or met somebody really interesting, and then you're all by yourself in a room and you have to actually write it down in a way that makes sense. That's the hardest part. The easy part is the first part. Yeah.
Great. So what's next for you, Jordan?
Well, a few things that I can't exactly fully talk about just yet, but what I can say is that I will be continuing to write these stories for a while, and I'm happy about that. Ooh, I see something in the chat. Oh, thank you for a most interesting presentation. Thank you for coming. Yeah,
I'm sorry, you were finishing that.
Yeah, I was saying that I'm going to continue writing these stories for as far and wide as I can. I'm currently working on a longer project about my own family's history. As we hinted at the beginning, I have these really interesting family stories that I want to dig deeper into. That's why I'm in Argentina right now. And it is a special project to me that I'm excited to get out into the world.
Great. We have a question. You had so many interesting adventures. Did you have a favorite place, or
Yeah, two questions.
Yeah.
So the first one is, did I have a favorite place or experience? Because we spoke that I think favorite person is different from favorite place. It's true. I've actually never been asked this question of my favorite place as opposed to my favorite person who I met. Right at the end of the river, where the river meets the Caribbean Sea, is one of the most spectacular things that I've ever seen in my life. Basically, you have this ashen colored river that is like totally chaotic and flowing in all sorts of different directions, meeting the most beautiful shimmering blue Caribbean Ocean that you could imagine, as the Caribbean is shimmering blue and beautiful. And at the end of this jetty that's 5 miles long, you see the gray water and the blue water smashed together in this like explosion of color and fury. And if I have to think about it, and I thought about it a lot while writing this book, that goes back to this idea of beauty and struggle and these juxtapositions of happiness and sadness and victory and defeat and conflict and peace that run a length through this book. And it was fitting that at the end, those two things were colliding in this explosion of water. It was a sight to behold. And the second question, also, I want to thank Kim who asked that question, and I'm happy to see Kim and Tad there. Kim is the reason why we're able to do this presentation today. So thank you, Kim. How did you go about immersing yourself in people's lives? This is an important and good question as well, because I think that when people think about a journalist, they think that it's somebody who comes in with, okay, my list of questions I'm going to ask, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in a very kind of structured, formulaic way. That is not how I reported this book. I did not come with prepared questions. I kind of knew what stories I wanted to go after, but sometimes it was totally improvised. And I would just go off of what people asked, what people wanted to talk about, and what people thought. I would always ask, who should I be speaking with? What should I be talking about or listening about? And sometimes it took time to build bridges of trust with people. Soccer was one way that I did this. I love playing and watching soccer, and that's a very universal sport that is a way to connect with people. Playing music, singing. I had a lot of sing-alongs along the Magdalena. Things like that are really just ordinary, everyday, fun things to do. Built these bridges of trust with people who, we were very different from each other in many different ways, but we were able to have these really productive exchanges, I think, because we trusted each other. And, immersing myself in people's lives was related to that.
Did they ever ask you about what it was like to live in New York?
Yes, all the time. Questions about the United States, all the time. And the questions varied from like, how much does it cost to go to college, to what do you think of the current president, to, is it easy to live in the United States? Is it as easy as people say it is? Because some people inevitably maybe have dreams of going to the United States. So those were some really, really interesting conversations. And always when I spoke about the United States, I made it clear that I was just speaking about what I knew of the United States, because the United States is gigantic and I only come from a very small part of it. But those were interesting conversations, because in return, then it gave me permission to ask those questions about Colombia, which I was trying to get at the whole time.
And I'm sure you'll never complain about the heat in New York again after experiencing what it's like in Colombia.
Never. I'm in Buenos Aires summer right now, where there's no air conditioning in the apartment, and I don't mind at all. I sleep with the windows open like it's nothing, because 70 degrees at night is nothing compared to 85 degrees at night. And yeah, that was some really, really hot weather.
Fantastic. Does anyone else have any more questions for
Here's one.
Jordan?
What are some places you might want to explore in the future? I really want to go to the Middle East. I'm trying to learn Arabic now at a very slow snail's pace, but I want to go to the Middle East because I think I have a lot of ties there that I've never explored. I've never been, and I'd like to go to Baghdad if I can. That would be an amazing place to go because of my mother's family history there. And I'm interested in places like Egypt and Syria, which is probably not going to happen for a while. Yeah, I'm right now. I'm on an Arabic bend. What was the hardest part of people's lives? I mean, a lot. Like I could kind of run down the list, but I think everything kind of comes back to the legacy of conflict in Colombia. Colombia was, has had more than a half a century of armed conflict. And as a result, it's impacted people's lives in every single way, from fishermen who pick out bloated corpses that were dumped into the river, floating down, to people whose loved ones were disappeared, to people who've lost their livelihoods because of conflict impacting their towns, goes on and on. But I think that living in a country where violence is so endemic for such a long time, talking about understanding a place, I'm not sure I could ever fully understand that because I'm lucky enough to never have experienced it. But I was able to get a glimpse into what that is like from the people I spoke with.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for